All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of This is Automation Live. I'm your host, Corey Dallas, and we're very happy to have you here today. Before we get started, I'd like to ask anybody out there that hasn't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. That's really helpful for us and means a lot when you do that. If you have questions, comments, ideas for an episode, you can find my contact information either in the description below, or you can just use the different methods that YouTube has for reaching out. So really excited to have you here today. We've got a great topic, less maybe technical to start with than some of the other topics we've been looking at, but there's definitely some good technical content in here, how to actually implement some of these intellectual property mechanisms. So without further ado, we'll be talking about managing intellectual property today. We'll talk a little bit about what intellectual property is. We'll talk about some of the software mechanisms to protect your intellectual property, as well as some of the hardware mechanisms to protect your intellectual property. We'll jump into Automation Studio a little bit to look at some of those, what they look like in an actual project. And hopefully you can walk away from this with a better idea of how to protect all of that code that you work so hard on and all of the machines and systems that you work so hard to build. So that's ultimately the goal here. Coming up in 2 days, so on Thursday, we have our Intro to Git episode. Git is one of many version control implementations. It's one that, is pretty popular. So it's one that we want to cover, especially in the context of Automation Studio. So how to use Git with Automation Studio. We'll talk about high level of what Git is, what are some of the different Git commands and how you use those, some of the tools, and then look at, a couple examples of using it with an actual Automation Studio project. So that'll be a good one for those of you that are not using version control. I would definitely recommend to tune in. We have, I think, a pretty compelling argument for why you should be using version control. And then we'll also talk about, again, exactly how to do it so you can start using it right away on your next project. So that's going to be a really good one, and we're excited about it. But for now, let's quickly jump into an overview of intellectual property. So when we talk about intellectual property, what do we actually mean? And why is it important to manage it, right? So intellectual property is basically all of those things that you're creating in your software or in your machine. It doesn't have to be software, but we're mostly talking in the context of software here. All of those things that kind of differentiate you in the market. These are the things that you can sell on, right? This is what makes my machine faster or my machine more scalable or more open communication wise. All of these different software components that are helping you differentiate your machine in the market. So that's great. Those are the things that make, your company, your machine. That's awesome. But the thing that we need to be careful of is that we're not exposing those software components to the public, because no matter how optimistic we want to be, there are people out there that are willing to either maliciously or innocently manipulate your intellectual property to benefit themselves. So we want to be careful of that, right? To protect the investment that you've made in R&D and to protect essentially what is your property. That's your software, your machine. We want to make sure that that stays in the right hands. And again, it may not have malicious intent, but if you're, for example, leaving your source code available for people to see, there's some liability even there if your machine has safety functions or something like that. So it's definitely something that is a topic of concern usually, but often machine builders or programmers don't really understand what tools they have at their disposal to make sure they're protecting that. So we're going to be looking at in kind of two different approaches. And I mentioned this already, but we'll be looking at it from a software perspective as well as a hardware perspective. So those are kind of the two main functions within the B&R suite anyway, that help you protect that intellectual property. So we'll start off with some of the software functions, and we'll kind of just jump right in. So the first one that we'll look at is compiled binary on the target. So what does that mean? When we say compiled binary, this is basically, there's a compiler in Automation Studio. When you write your code, it's human readable, right? So even though it's not, grammatical English, it is human readable. You can understand, you can follow it. When that code runs through the compiler, it becomes, machine level code, let's say. So zeros and ones, the binary code. And that's what the PLC is actually operating on. So this is kind of inherently built into the B&R ecosystem, is that the code that's running on the PLC or the target, it's just another name for PLC in this instance, is always compiled binary. So that's really nice because it's much more efficient than the opposite of that, which would be interpreted code, where you have that kind of human readable code being interpreted in real time. This is different in that, again, the PLC is just seeing the zeros and ones, which is nice because A, it's faster, but B, because it is inherently IP safe. So when you transfer to a B&R PLC, it's just binary code going over. That's not code that I or you could reverse engineer without probably orders of magnitude times more work than it would take to just rewrite the code from scratch. So again, that's a very strong level of protection that's pretty much built in to any transfer that you make. You're always transferring these binary files. So that's one important distinction to be aware of. And that's going to protect you from any reverse engineering efforts. Okay. So moving on, this is somewhat analogous to the one that we just talked about. This is omitting or encrypting source code on the target or on the PLC. So I mentioned that everything running on a B&R PLC is going to be compiled binary. It's always compiled code, always binary. You can't read it. You're going to have a heck of a time trying to reverse engineer it. But there is an option for good reason to transfer your source files onto the PLC. So why would you want to do that? Well, there's the potential that when a service technician needs to see the machine, they want to see the exact code that's on the machine, and maybe it's easier to just transfer it to the PLC instead of looking to your version control system. Maybe they want to compare what's running on the PLC versus the latest software that you have. So you would need the source files on the PLC to do those kinds of things. And there's really three different use cases, which we're looking at here on the screen. Kind of the least secure one is to enable the transfer of your source code, but not encrypt or password protect it. So you're basically just saying, world, here is my source code, do with it what you will. This is, we see the industry moving away from this. It's been honestly pretty common for that to be the case. Here's the source code, it's your machine, you bought it, make changes to it how you will. But as we're moving more towards, use-based contracts, for example, or efficiency-based contracts, a lot of the OEMs out there want to really tightly control the source code, or at least really tightly control parts of it, to ensure, the efficiency of their machine, to ensure the user experience, to ensure, they're mitigating liability from source code changes, again, to protect IP. So we're seeing this as a less and less preferable option. And especially in the context of intellectual property, it's certainly not a great option. So then there's really two other options. One is no source code transferred at all. That is probably the most secure, obviously, because there's just no source code to be had. So that's kind of the top right scenario that you're looking at, or no source code found. That would be the ideal scenario for protecting your IP. But maybe, again, you have a good reason for the source code to be on the system, and you want to make sure that that's available for your service techs or for your customers, maybe in some cases. So what you want to do is transfer the source code to the target, to the PLC, but encrypt it. So when you encrypt it and password protect it, that means somebody can't just go into the memory and pull the files off and be able to read them. And it also means that somebody needs to have authorized access to use them. So using the encryption and password protection is a really strong way to make sure that you can have access to your source files on the PLC, but only the people that really need to see it are going to be able to see it, and then it's otherwise protected. So we will go ahead and jump into Automation Studio for the first time and take a look at that. Little break from the slides here. If we're looking in my Automation Studio file, if we want to, again, encrypt our source code on the target, this is actually a function of the configuration view. So again, if you haven't seen the Automation Studio 101 video, go check that one out, where we talk about the logical view, configuration view, physical view. But we're going to be looking in the configuration view. So you can see I've got multiple configurations here. The one that I'm in right now is the X90, which is our mobile automation controller. If I right click on my configuration and select properties, it's going to bring up a window. And you'll see there's 3 tabs: general, details, and source files. So source files is kind of obviously the one that I want to look at. So we'll click on source files, and there you go. I've now got this checkbox to store project source files on the target. So when I check that, I get a couple options here. We won't go through all of these. They're not super important, but you may want to protect your source files. In that case, you would want to enter the password, in this field right here. So it's really as easy as that. By default, there will be no project files transferred to the target. Again, that's like the most inherently secure approach. You can transfer it without password protection, but we certainly would recommend to do it with password protection. So that's where you would do that. Okay, excellent. We'll go ahead and close out of that and jump back. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, how to omit or encrypt the source code on your target. Again, really simple. Just check a box and you're giving yourself, another level of protection. Okay. You'll see this, there's a theme of using binary here, and that's because, binary is not human readable. So it's kind of inherently protected from these reverse engineering scenarios. So another place that we see using binaries is actually in libraries. So for those of you that aren't aware, you can actually wrap up your different functions and function blocks, your key algorithms, key processes inside of libraries. And a library is just really a collection of functions and function blocks. So that can be really great for making your code scalable, for making nice interfaces in your code. Again, we talked about this in the organization for Automation Studio episode. Maybe you have a servo control library and a stepper control library, and that makes your code really scalable. But when you make a user-defined library, a custom library, what you get is what's at the bottom here. This kind of little blue book indicates a user library. In this case, it's a structured text library. It's not that important, but you'll see I've got a function defined. My adder just takes value 1 and value 2, adds them together, gives me an output, and the source code for that function block is sitting right there. So again, this creates the problem that anybody that has your project is now in full ownership of your source code for that custom library. So that may not be a problem, but again, in cases where you want to control the access to your IP, you may want to consider using binary libraries. So what we can do is take a custom library, a user library, and actually export it as binaries. And when you do that, what you get is a nice library file. You can import that back into your project or into a different project. And what you would get is what you're seeing at the top here, this little green book with the lock next to it. That indicates that this is a binary library. So there's no source files available to look at. And the other thing you'll notice is if you're looking in your libraries, the B&R standard libraries are all going to be binary libraries. That's because that core functionality is kind of protected, right? So you just need to use the functions. You don't really need to be looking in the back end. And so that's kind of the same tool that you would implement to protect your IP. So any critical algorithms that you have, critical processes that you really want to wrap up tight as your IP, you can put those inside of these custom libraries, export them as binaries, bring them back into your project as a binary library, and now that code is completely basically locked away. So that's again a really powerful function to make sure that anybody that has access to your project is not going to be able to see kind of the nitty-gritty important part of the project. So again, we'll jump in and I'll just show you a quick example of that. We've already kind of looked at it, but here you can see I've got my libraries folder. So it's got all of these different B&R libraries with the lock next to them to show me that they're binary libraries. And then I've got my custom library. So inside of my custom library, I've got just one function block defined. My adder takes an input of value 1 and value 2 and outputs them to a sum, right? Now, if we open up my source code, you can see that my function block is very, very complicated. It just adds value 1 and value 2 and outputs it as a sum. Okay, so what I did before we started the live stream is actually exported this as a binary. And I'll show you how to do that in a second. But when I re-imported it, I renamed it just for the sake of simplicity. When I re-imported it, now you can see I can still see my functions, right? I need to know what the names of the functions are and what their inputs are, but there's no source code here. So that's all kind of protected in the back end, and you're not going to be able to see that that critical, intellectual property. So that's now protected. Okay. So if you want to do that, to create a custom library, you just bring it in from the toolbox if you're in, an appropriate package. So in this case, I use the IEC library there. You can bring that in, build out your library. We won't really cover that right now. But once you've got that built, if you want to export it as a binary, what you can do is highlight your library. So again, I've highlighted my blue book library. You can go to File and Export Library. When you select Export Library, you'll get a pop-up that, again, by default is going to show Export Library as binary library. So if you wanted to just export it as a readable source, then you would uncheck this box. But again, for this case, what I did was exported that as a binary library. You can pick the target location. I won't do it right now since we've already done it. But from there, you can then just add a new library from the toolbox using, again, the existing libraries. So you'll see here we have existing libraries. If you select that, you can go find that library that you just exported. And from there, boom, you've got yourself a compiled binary library that is very well protected. All right. So jumping back in, we'll call that wrapped up for binary libraries. Again, this is where you want to put kind of that critical code that you want to protect, and you want it fully protected in your project. Compiled as binaries, no chance that anybody could guess a password or anything. So fully encrypted and good to go. All right, so what if I still want to be able to modify the code inside of my project instead of having to manage my, my libraries in a separate project? This may be protected somewhere else. There is the possibility to encrypt specific files in Automation Studio and to set unique passwords for each of those. So maybe you want to, let's say the sequencer application that I'm showing here, I want to protect that structured text source code. I don't want just anybody to be able to open that. When you protect it, encrypt it, you'll get, instead of kind of the standard little blank page, you'll get a little blank page with a key on it. So that indicates that this is encrypted. So I think the best way to kind of show this is to actually just go look at it again. So here we'll look at the encryption. So you can see this is the sequencer file that I'm in the main structured text. Now it's already open. So of course I can edit it, but what we'll do is actually close it. And then I'll try to reopen that file, and you'll notice I get this password prompt. So I won't tell you my password. It's 1234. But once I enter the correct password, it will open up that file for me. Okay, so again, a nice clean way to protect your files. If you want to do that, you would want to select the file that you want to encrypt. In this case, my main structured text file. Right click it, select the properties. From there, you'll want to click on, the two tabs are general and details. You'll click on details. And then there's just a checkbox for encryption. So if you want to unencrypt it, you would uncheck the box. And if you want to encrypt it, you would check the box. And you'll need to enter a password and confirm it to make sure. And of course, if you're changing the setting, you do need to enter the password. That would be a pretty unsecure system if you could just unencrypt it without the password. So yep, anytime that you're going to encrypt or unencrypt, you need the password. So here I've just unencrypted it, as you can see. So it's returned to just the normal blank page. We'll go in and re-encrypt it just for the sake of example. So again, I click on details, check the encrypted box, type my password, confirm my password, and hit OK. Now you can see it's got the key next to it, and the next time that I were to close this out, I would again be prompted with a password window. Very good. So again, this is a good way to protect any of those IP sensitive programs or files. It's a bit of a different method than the binary libraries. I would say that the binary libraries is maybe the more preferred method, but it's a little bit more complex logistically for how you manage that, because you've got to now manage the source code of that library as well as the other project. Here it gives you a way to encrypt those files directly while still allowing those that have the proper password to access it. Good. So that is the majority of the software approach, at least kind of the big stuff. So now we'll move into the hardware approach. And a lot of the hardware approach, mostly all of it that we're going to talk about today anyway, is centered around this little USB dongle. So if you're not familiar with B&R or you just have never used one of these, even if you are familiar with B&R, this is called a technology guard. So this is exactly what it looks like, a little USB dongle, very much like for your wireless mouse that just sticks in, except for this device is actually a tamper-proof licensing system that also has some other really nice functionality for protecting IP. So B&R uses the technology guard for B&R licenses. So for example, if you have a MapView license in your system, it would live on a technology guard. But what I think is a somewhat underused application is that you can actually put custom licenses and use the memory on the technology guard to further protect your own IP, just in the same way that B&R is using it to protect MapView and those other software components. So a couple interesting things that we'll talk about. One, there is a library for the technology guard that is called AS Guard. With that AS Guard library, you can access a ton of different functions on the technology guard. One of those is access to, it's a small amount of data, but really powerful, 200 bytes of data that are tamper-proof. So you can't plug this USB into your computer and change those files. It's all encrypted and protected, so you're not going to be able to manipulate it in any way. So what would you maybe want to put in this super secure data location? Maybe you'd want to log the machine serial number. So that way, you know, someone can't just take that tech guard out and put it into a different machine. We can verify the serial number against what's logged in the technology guard from the initial commissioning. And maybe that's something that you want to do. Maybe you want to log some critical production data for the purposes of warranty. So maybe you want to log the initial startup date or something like that, so that you can verify for your warranty processes, you know, exactly what the conditions are for that machine. Or again, maybe you want to log misuse. So let's say the machine was operated outside of its temperature specifications and you have some temperature monitoring system. Maybe you want to log that in a secure place instead of in the regular, in some sort of process variable or something like that that could easily be overwritten. Maybe you want to log it in a place that's secure and tamper-proof, so that you know when somebody comes back and says, hey, my machine stopped working, you can pull this data and show, hey, you were actually operating outside of the temperature spec here, here, and here. Maybe we should look into this and see what happened there, because this is not, the standard operating conditions for the machine. So that can give you, again, nice ways to protect yourself, but also to, again, protect your IP, so that you're sure that people aren't just, copying your data kind of throughout the world. Okay, so that's through the AS Guard library. Again, we can take a quick peek at that in just a second, but I wanted to talk about one more functionality before we do that. So again, with AS Guard, you can write to this data. There's no other way to write or read that data. Okay. The other functionality built into the technology guard is a couple timers. So one of those timers is measuring power on. So anytime that there's power on the technology guard, basically whenever it's plugged in and the system is running, it's counting time. Okay, so that can be used for use-based licensing, for example, or again, measuring warranty conditions, something like that. There's also another timer that again can be accessed with the ESGuard library to time whatever you want. Again, what you have is if you're using just a standard variable or tag to count time for something, that can be overwritten just as easily as you're writing to it. You could overwrite it. Certainly if you're writing to like a USB, just a standard USB into maybe a text file or a CSV file to log some time of usage or something, they could take, the end customer could feasibly take the USB out of the system, plug it into their computer, make a change, and then plug it back in. Again, we hope that's never the case, that there's any maliciousness, but it does happen, right? So we have to put these protections in place because this stuff inevitably does happen. Most people out there have good intent, and maybe it's even just a mistake that they've done that. But this gives you the flexibility to fully protect that, to make sure that everything is kind of foolproof, mistake proof. So that timer is again available inside of ESGuard for use-based licensing to measure the different usages of different functions within the system. And again, there's creative ways that you can use the memory on the technology guard and the timers on the technology guard to further protect your machine and further protect your IP. Okay, so quickly we'll jump into Automation Studio. There is a sample. So for those of you that again are familiar, you can load library samples into Automation Studio. The way to do that is inside of the toolbox. There's actually something called library samples, so you can see that right there. When you click on library samples, it'll give you a full list of the different libraries that have samples, and they have them in different languages. So if you want to try out a library for the first time, that's a really good place to look. So I've actually just loaded the technology guarding sample into here. So I'll open that program just for us to quickly look at. So the things that we mentioned were operating time, custom time, and reading and writing user data. So that's kind of managed in these middle states here. This is just a state machine that runs through all of the different functions of ESGuard. So we'll kind of quickly jump down to the ones that are important to us, and we won't look at this in great detail, but just to show you kind of the scope of what it would take to implement this. So this code here is just reading the operating time. Again, there's functions. This guard read operating time, you call that function and it'll give you the time. Very similar to the customer operating time. The only difference is that the guard operating time is always running when it's powered up, and the customer operating time, you would need to start and stop that by yourself. So you can see we've got state 31, which is starting the timer, and this state 32, which is stopping the timer. Okay. Again, very similar. Super simple function blocks to read and write user data. So you're just using the guard read data or guard write data function blocks to write that data. And again, you could easily wrap this up into a binary library to make sure that it's protected and that people can't come in here and change this to even further protect yourself. So they were using kind of a combination of the software and hardware functions that we've talked through. Okay, good. Now, another really nice thing with the technology guard, we often come across the challenge that, okay, my system's running compiled binaries. My libraries are binary. I didn't transfer source code, but at the end of the day, there is still memory on the PLC or on the target that can be imaged. So you can take this CFast card out of the PLC, you can make a copy of it, and you can put that into another PLC. So again, we hope this doesn't happen, but believe it or not, this happens more often than you would think. And that's the scenario of copycats and unauthorized distribution, where maybe someone has acquired legitimately a copy of the machine, and they've taken it upon themselves to make copies of that CFast card and deploy it in different machines without the right protections in place. That's going to be possible in a lot of cases, and it's something that a lot of people don't think about. Again, we said compiled binaries are protecting you inherently. People can't reverse engineer your code, but what if they don't want to reverse engineer your code? What if they just want to distribute your system, unauthorized and undercut your pricing? That's possible. Okay, so to really protect ourselves to the fullest extent, we can use the technology guard to prevent this being a feasible implementation. So what we do is we take that technology guard and either implement custom licenses. So again, we talked about how B&R has licenses for map view. You can have licenses for specific functions, or maybe just for that entire machine. So let's say this is a capper. So you could have, your custom capper license that won't run unless that license is present. And those licenses are managed in a licensing server. You can't image the licenses. You can't image the technology guard. It's fully protected and encrypted. So anytime you want to deploy a new machine, you've got to pull a new license from the licensing server, put that onto the technology guard, or the capper is not going to work. So that again protects you. Sure, maybe you could still take an image of the CFast card, but if you plug that into another PLC, depending on how you set it up, it could either completely shut down, or it could just be running in maybe some sort of limp along mode, where maybe the machine speed is limited to 50% without the license. So this is going to, again, severely hinder somebody from being able to copycat your system, or have some unauthorized distribution network of your system, just by having those licenses on the technology guard. Again, another way, not just custom licenses, but using that 200 bytes of data, you can write the serial number of that PLC, so that instead of having a custom license on there, you're just making sure that this code is this license is running with this PLC, and if you don't detect that, then the system's not going to work. So when we talk about making the system not work, it's often a question of like, well, what happens if the license isn't there? And that really is completely up to the developer. So using the ASGuard library, you can read the license, or you can read that internal data, make the checks that you need to make, and you've determined, okay, this system is not authorized for one reason or another. It doesn't have the right license, or it doesn't have the right serial number. Something's not right here. What do we want to do? You can implement a limited operation mode. Again, we mentioned this already. Maybe that technology guard is enabling full capacity of the machine, and without it, it only runs for a certain number of hours a day at full capacity, and then reduces down to 50% speed. All of the servo motion reduces down. Maybe it's just as simple as putting a message in the logger. So a system level logger message. That way hey, this is being run without a license. Maybe you have an IoT system set up. Your system is on the network, and you're monitoring your systems again with some IoT implementation. Maybe you want a notification if your system is run without a license. So you could set that up. We set a flag inside of the PLC, push that out to the cloud, and now that an unauthorized system is being operated. So really, at the developer level, you have full control over the impact of running without the proper licenses, which gives you the full ability to be flexible for the end user to let's say the technology guard breaks or something, or the PLC breaks and they need to switch that out. Maybe you don't want to completely cripple them because that could certainly cause some issues. So you again have full control over that. Maybe you want a 48-hour grace period. You can use the built-in technology guard timer to count that and not be able to be manipulated. Again, there's really creative ways that you can implement this to make sure that your IP is protected, to make sure that your distribution channels are protected, to make sure that your market is protected, while still making sure that you're flexible and understanding to the needs of your customers and to the flexibility that they require. So that's again a really nice way to make sure you're protecting against copycats and unauthorized distribution. Technology Guard is really, really great for that. Okay, so let's jump back into Automation Studio. There's a couple final things that we wanted to touch on. So we showed the encryption of the files, but one thing I wanted to quickly look at is what does that actually look like? So for those of you that don't know, if you open your File Explorer, this is the path of the project that I have open up here. This project's map view highlight 5.9. You can actually access all of the files in the File Explorer. So if I go into Logical and Sequencer, that is actually, the files that I have inside of Sequencer here, okay? So you'll see I have my main structured text program, my type file, my variable file. So I've opened these up as text. So just right click and open them with Notepad++ in this case. You can use any text editor. And this is my encrypted file. So you can see this is pretty unreadable. There's nothing that I can do with this. This does not help me to copycat your machine. This doesn't help me to do anything really. It's completely encrypted and I'm gonna have a really tough time doing anything with this, right? Now, if we look at an unencrypted file, wow, look how readable and nice that is, okay? So this is kind of what we're talking about when we talk about encryption and protection. It's not just password protecting inside of the IDE, it's actually encrypting the files so that they're not readable without that password in Automation Studio. So again, if you're not protecting your files, someone could easily pull up the project and copy all of this code. But with encryption, you're protected from something like that. Okay. So I think we've shown the vast majority of this other stuff. And there we go. Okay, so looking forward, just really quickly, we have the Intro to Git episode coming up in just 2 days. That's going to be a good one. Make sure you check it out and set up notifications for that one if you haven't already, so you get a little notification on your phone or your computer when we go live on that one. To wrap us up, again, intellectual property is really, really important. It's something that more and more developers are thinking about when they're building out their Automation Studio projects. And they're asking the question, what can I do to make sure that the projects that I'm developing are protected from an IP standpoint? The good thing is that there's already tools in place in Automation Studio to help the developers do that. So we talked about there's kind of two different approaches there. One is the hardware approach, the other is the software approach. With the software approach, you have all those tools at your fingertip. There's nothing extra that you need. You don't need to change anything about your configuration, so to speak. That's just really a workflow change. So encrypting, sensitive source code files. And again, not everything may need to be protected. If it's just a recipe handling system, maybe that doesn't need to be protected. That's not really what is differentiating your machine in the market. But if you have a very sensitive control algorithms, for example, you might want to wrap those up inside of a binary library to make sure that they're protected at the highest levels. On the hardware side, you have a really great tool at your disposal with the Technology Guard. The Technology Guard is powerful in the functions that are built in through the ASGuard library. So writing to protected memory, having protected timers available for you, as well as, using custom licenses. So this is the exact same, I've said this already, this is the exact same protection mechanism that B&R is using to protect B&R's IP. So, why not use that same tool to protect the IP inside of your machine? So using custom licenses, again, you can protect fully from duplication, from unauthorized use. You can use it to protect your spare parts channel. As much control as you want to have, you have that flexibility inside of the B&R ecosystem. Now, whether those are software solutions or hardware solutions, or some combination of both, depending on the level of protection that you're looking for, those are all there for you. And most of these settings are inherently secure, like the compiled binary that's running on the PLC and like the lack of source code that's being transferred to the PLC. So these are all really powerful tools that you can use starting right now, starting on your next project. Use those compiled binary libraries, use the source code encryption, make sure you set up an ASGuard application to fully protect what's most important, which is what differentiates your machine, your project from all the competition out there, to make sure it doesn't get into the wrong hands. whether that's malicious or not, and make sure that you're protecting yourself, your machine, and your business. Good. All right, everybody. I hope that was really helpful for those of you out there that have concerns about this. It's a really complex topic, but hopefully we were able to break it down into some easy to digest pieces, show you what that looked like in Automation Studio. I hope you found this useful. Again, please hit the subscribe button, set up notifications so that you're getting all the latest live streams. And we're really excited that we've had such a good response for the live streams, and every time you share or like or comment, that does mean a lot. Read all of them, look at all of them. So again, thank you very much, and we will see you next time on This is Automation Live.